Hi, I'm Carl Faze. Welcome to Next Steps. This short series is built on the knowledge that no choice or step we take is an isolated incident. Every decision is a step down a path with inevitable outcomes. A question for each of us is, where are our choices taking us? In this series, we're going to look at the stories of 4 people, from an Australian Olympian to an ex-drug dealer, a mum who looks after troubled teenagers, and a successful businessman. Each of these people will tell us some of their story and the choices that they made. Each will challenge you to ask the question, what's your next step? In our series, Faith Runs Deep, we interviewed Australian Olympian Eloise Wellings. Eloise is a leading Australian middle distance track runner who's now extending her competitive running to marathons. For Eloise, running and the dream of international competition started very young. When did you start running competitively? Like every kid runs.
Yeah.
When did you start running competitively?
Well, I was about 5 years old when I started running. My mum was a really good runner. My uncle was a good runner, so it was already in the family. And my mum used to run with a group called Billy's Bushies in the National Park down where I grew up in Grace Point. And yeah, she just used to meet those guys at 6 a.m. There's a big group of them, and you know, every now and then I'd go with her and run as far as I could, and then turn around and run home.
Yep.
And that's how it started for me. Then I went onto Little Athletics and kind of kicked off from there.
Wow. Do you remember the time where you thought, I could actually make the Olympics, or I really want to make the Olympics? Do you remember that thought?
Yeah, I do. I remember watching the Barcelona Olympics on TV, and I was watching the women's distance running events go around, because that's what I was really passionate about at Little Athletics. That seemed to what I was kind of edging towards, and I just remember being so inspired by watching those women. And I remember turning to my mum and dad, this is as a 10-year-old, and saying, I'm going to do that one day.
Wow.
And and then it just became a childhood obsession.
Competing in the London Olympics was a dream come true for Eloise. Yet, like many athletes, it was a long, hard road. Injury, disappointment, and painful rehab was part of the journey to success. What was that like, walking out on the London Olympics?
It was amazing. Honestly, it's so cliche, but my dream was coming true in that moment, walking out to that start line. I was just having I remember having all of these flashbacks of the moments that I'd really had to fight for this moment, of standing on the starting line at my first Olympics, and all the injuries and the heartbreak and the setbacks that I'd gone through, all the disappointments, all the times that I wanted to quit, all the times that I was on crutches, and all the times that I was running in freezing cold water and cross training, and you know, just continuing to just push on and believe that that one day my chance would come up and my opportunity would come up, and I'd be able to live my dream. And
Is that your biggest disappointment, not getting to those Olympics at first?
The first Olympics, which was in Sydney, I missed out on 3 before I finally made London, all through injury and all through, you know, devastating, disappointing setbacks. But I learned so much throughout each of them, and like I came to faith. I came to become a Christian after I missed out on my first Olympics, and then, you know, learned so many other lessons about myself and grew in resilience. And I mean, at the time, no one can tell you that this is going to be good. No one can tell you that missing out on Olympics and being injured and, you know, having to cross train and do all of the things that you hate to do is going to be good. And, you know, but God always brings something good out of those times.
Imagine missing 3 Olympics due to injury. Yet Eloise hinted that there was a positive outcome of these failures, her journey to faith. Remarkably, what you will hear from Eloise is that the journey to faith was not so much a struggle of belief and intellectual discussion. It was about people showing love and care and extending an invitation.
I was 16 when I qualified for my first Olympics. I was in year 11 at school, and running was who I was. It was everything to me. It was because I was good at it. That's why I thought that's why I was popular, and that's why I was, that's why I liked myself, essentially. And then it was taken away, and I was going to miss the Olympics, and I was devastated, and I got really, really down and discouraged. And I thought that, I grew up in a Catholic family, and we went to church every Sunday, and I still had this really warped sense of who God was. I thought that God was punishing me through my injury for something that I'd done wrong. And one day at school, I was sitting on my own at lunch, and it was soon after that I'd just been told that I would miss the Olympics through this injury, and a new girl came over. Her name was Lisa, and she sat beside me, and she said, "Hey, I just want you to know that I've been praying for you, and that I've got some friends from church praying for you. I heard about what happened with your injury," and she said, "I'm just believing that God's got a great plan for you and that everything's going to work out."
Wow.
And I think in that moment, it just really touched me that she had this idea of God, that she could pray to him for something so trivial as my injury. Even though it was a big deal to me, I thought that God was so far away from it. I didn't realise that he cared. And so, I went to church with my new friend Lisa, and I heard the gospel. I heard about Jesus. And after a couple of weeks, I decided that this is what I wanted to live for. I wanted to live for Jesus, and I wanted to become a Christian.
There are many occasions when winners in sporting events thank Jesus for their success. Now, this can have an unintended consequence because it's connecting faith and Christianity to success. I mean, the logical conclusion for some is that Jesus' role in my life is to make me more successful in sport, in business, in family life, anything I attempt. The recipe for success is to add some Jesus to help me reach my goals. I asked Eloise if becoming a Christian made her run faster to be a more successful athlete. How did that change? Did you run faster?
No, I mean, it didn't, not, all of my problems didn't just disappear. My injury didn't all of a sudden get better, although it did over time. But it meant that in my heart, regardless of what happened in running, regardless of what happened with what I did, I was still loved, and I was made whole, and I was given a new identity in Christ. Before that, my whole value and my worth was wrapped up in running, and the outcome and the results was so important to me in terms of my identity and who I was. But realizing who Jesus was and having a revelation of who he is and how much he loves me and us, that was a game changer.
Yeah.
Because it meant that it would free me up to do what I was passionate about and what he had given me the gift to do without the threat of losing my identity each time I did that.
Did you notice the point Eloise made here? She's not saying that following Jesus instantly fixed all her injuries and made her run faster. She's saying that following Jesus changed the way she looked at running and changed where she looked for her identity. It's not that Jesus made her win. It was that following Jesus changed her attitude to winning. When the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Philippi, he wanted them to know that what made someone significant in his day, his family, his education, his lifestyle, he now considered to be absolutely rubbish in comparison to knowing Jesus. He went on to write this: "I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ. Eloise reflected this attitude of Paul. She had a different set of values. This was also demonstrated with what she focused on. Her efforts were not just about herself and winning, but rather a focus on others. Eloise and her friends started a not-for-profit called Love Mercy. This was in response to what she'd heard from Julius, an African athlete, on the plight of the people in Uganda.
I never thought that I would be working in Africa and standing alongside people through a foundation in Africa. I met another athlete, Julius Achon. He's Ugandan, and it was actually through missing out on my third Olympics. My third attempt at making the Olympics. I flew over to America. I had an injury, and it was this last-ditch attempt to rehab this injury, and I stayed in this house that other international athletes were staying at, and it was there that I met Julius. And we just became immediate friends. We had the same sense of humour. He's a great runner, and we just got chatting. We would go to training each day together, and he began to tell me his story of his community in northern Uganda, and his story of where he had come from, being born into poverty and captured by LRA rebels during the war in northern Uganda, and then his miraculous story of getting through that and going on to compete at 2 Olympic Games. And he shared his vision with me of wanting to go back to his community to start some community development projects to help people get back on their feet. And yeah, our friendship just kept evolving, and we ended up going to Julius and Grace's wedding in Uganda, and we decided that we would start the Love Mercy Foundation to, Julius asked for our help in terms of getting things off the ground to help people in his village and start these projects.
Your faith influenced how your attitude towards running and competition. Does your faith also influence what you do with Love Mercy?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're called as Christians to help the poor, and it doesn't really it shouldn't be any more complicated than that. And to me, help can look a number of different ways, and help isn't necessarily going over and building something, but help can be standing alongside someone and believing in the resource and the strength that they already have to go and give them access to opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have had. But yeah, that's what we're called to do as Christians.
Where are your choices leading you? Towards a self-centered and self-reliant lifestyle, or a life of giving and service? Choosing to follow Jesus to find a Christian faith is a key decision, but learning to follow Jesus is another significant choice. That will not always mean a life of ease and success. It may be a life of challenge and service.
it reminds us of the power of story, doesn't it? The story that we have and the story that God has and other people's stories, how important that is in our own journey of faith and our own journey of life. Evangelism, or sharing our faith, not has changed, because information's the same. Jesus is the same yesterday, today and forever. But the method of sharing that seems to evolve and change into better ways. I remember, many of you remember growing up in churches or being in churches where courses on evangelism were offered, but it was kind of like, let's make you a better salesperson for the cause of the gospel. Not all the time, and it was done with good intention, but at the end of the day, I remember going away from those courses thinking, I feel like I've got like I'm selling the Funkin' Wagnalls, if anybody remembers those, encyclopedias or something, and it's really important to close the deal, and I can't remember those 3 things that they're supposed to do, and if they had an objection, where to lead them, and all of that sort of stuff. And then finally, how to close the deal, how to get someone across the line of faith. Now, all that stuff, those components are probably important, but the method in which we share that faith is equally important in terms of our love for others. In those courses, often you were taught that sidetracks were the worst. If people got you off your topic because you had this pre-set thing, so when they started to talk about dinosaurs or the Crusades or the age of the earth or science or the doo-doo bird or whatever it was, that you had to quickly arrest that and get it back onto the topic. So that method, for me at least, was not very helpful, because there wasn't the emphasis, I don't think, in actually getting to know that human being in front of me. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes on reminding you of the power of the story. And the story is not just the story of Jesus. Now that sounds awful, but let me explain. The story of Jesus, the gospel, is of paramount importance, but your story is important too. But not only is your story important too, the other person's story is important as well. In sharing our faith, God's story should be told, and it's a great story. It's an epic story. It's not a small story. The world, we sometimes mistake that the quicker we can get the story and get it over, in other words, can we make it short, can we make it concise, then the world will really enjoy that story. But I don't think you have to look far to understand that the world loves an epic story. An epic story. Not a little story, an epic story. That's why people will binge watch endless hours of Netflix to get to the next part of the story, because they love a great story. It depends on how you tell the story, and God's story is an epic story. It's not a little story. It's not a one-episoder. It's a season upon season upon season of these great stories. If you've got BritBox, or you've got Binge, or you've got Stan, or you've got any other things that I'm paying for my family to watch, then you will know that you get onto a great series of stories, and it has 2 or 3 different series within that story. You just cannot wait to get to the next part of the story. So when we tell God's story, as revealed as best we can through the Bible, we need to understand that it is a big story, and it's a story that we cannot tell in its entirety. But we need to tell its story, that this great good news that God is real, that God is active, that God is forgiving. The second story is to share your story. And we've heard 2 stories today from young women who experienced the transformation in their life of God's love. Eloise and Rachel. Different contexts, different stories, but somehow their story intersected with this great redemptive story of God. So we need to learn our own story. We need to value our own story. And your story is as important as Eloise's story. Your story is as important as my story. Your story is as important as John Newton's story, who wrote Amazing Grace. We all have a story. And so in sharing that story, that goes a long way to convincing people that the information is really about transformation. An author on these things, Rebecca Pippa said, our problem in evangelism, for those who don't know, is sharing what you know to be good news, is not that we don't have enough information. It's that we don't know how to be ourselves. We forget that we're called to be witnesses to what we have seen and know, not to what we don't know. The key part, on our part, is authenticity and obedience, not a doctorate in theology. Now, I'm not bagging anybody who's got a doctorate in theology. Well done. But authenticity and obedience to transformation trumps information every time. So we have God's epic story, we have our story, which is valuable to God so much that his story intersects with our story. And then we have another person's story that we need to value and respect. And we've said that a bunch of times in church, have we not? That the person in front of us that we get the right to earn, or we earn the right to tell our story to, is not some inanimate object or an information receptive machine. They are a person who have their own story, who have got to the point wherever they are in life because of the events in their life. And so we need to value their story and be careful how we tell God's story and our story because of their story. It's presumptuous for us to tell another person about their story. So where do we find the points of intersection? I shared this at Explorers on Tuesday. This is a little Venn diagram. Who doesn't love a Venn diagram? So there's God's story, there's my story, and then there's the other story. And the overlapping parts is the place where evangelism is seen. You'll notice there's a place where God's story intersects with my story, and that's where saving grace occurs. That's what happened in Eloise's life. That's what happened in Rachel's life. And for many of you here, that's what happened in your life, or is happening in your life. Saving grace. That somehow God has saved you, not somehow, but through Jesus Christ, but somehow you have got that information, and it's not just information, it's become transformation for you. That's saving grace. That's the intersection where you can see all the evidences of God's love and reign changing you and saving you. But this other thing is called prevenient grace. That's that little bit on the other side. I don't know if you've heard that term. It's a kind of theological term, and we knocked around that a bit. Some people have never heard of it, but it's a term that really describes God's grace that is all around us, even if we don't acknowledge it as God's activity. In other words, it's the anticipating or going or preceding grace of God. In other words, if you're a person who's not a person of faith, you will have experienced, even though you don't recognize it, God's prevenient grace in your life. The fact that you took a breath is part of God's prevenient grace. The fact that you look at a mountain or a sunrise and say, oh my God, look at that. And you don't say it as an act of worship, but you know that somehow someone was responsible and needed to be praised for that. Prevenient grace is an important part. You see it all around you, and then maybe one day you join the dots and say, you know what, I've come to this place of saving grace, this place where I want to take the information and make it transformation, but I can see how God was active in my life here and here and here and here. And you'll celebrate that grace. And then your story becomes enmeshed because of God's story. And then you can't help but listen to another story and want to share that with other people. The method through which we do that is very important, and we're part of that process, are we not, in terms of sharing that story. There's a great sequence of this in 1 Corinthians 3 and 6-9. The Apostle Paul was explaining how the gospel kind of works in terms of people's lives, and that God uses people as his fellow workers in this process. And the Apostle Paul says, I planted the seed, which is a very popular analogy for the gospel, for the good news of Jesus. I planted that seed, but Apollos, who was a colleague of Paul's, he watered it. In other words, he took that seed and he exemplified it, he demonstrated it, he showed it in his life, and he watered it. But it was God, but God has been making it grow. And that's the sequence. We plant, others water, but God is the one who makes it grow. So neither the one who plants or the one who waters is really anything, but only God who makes things grow. For we are co-workers in God's service, and you are God's field, God's building, God's body. And so the grace of God is available through us because of God's story in us. So I hope today you go away knowing that identity is not found in what we own, and the titles we have, the money we got or don't have. Our titles, all that stuff sort of fades away, but our identity is found ultimately in a loving and growing relationship with God through Jesus Christ.